Warhammer 40,000 as a franchise is known for being incredibly dense in terms of the volume of the lore that has been created for it. There are hundreds of novels and books that are set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And as I'm sure everyone here would be aware of, there are several YouTube channels entirely dedicated to presenting the lore for Warhammer 40,000, usually as interpretations of official released lore as opposed to extrapolations on their own. It's also clear to me that 40K lore gets people very passionate, and the broader community can spend or has spent weeks debating certain aspects of the lore as it's developed. And as a historian, watching those arguments unfold reminds me a lot of the sort of debates my colleagues frequently would engage in. And that sort of defined my entire field of study. It got me thinking about how Warhammer 40,000 could be used as a vehicle for better understanding how historians are supposed to go about their jobs, which is always a bit of a problem, how historians are supposed to relate to the public. So as historians, we're taught that history is an ongoing process. Historians of today challenge narratives of the past in hopes that historians in the future will do so for their work, for their own work. There are numerous approaches or lens as to how one can go about history. Historians might focus on telling history through the perspective of nation states and rulers and individuals. This is what's called a great man theory of history. It's probably the most common way of discussing history, particularly at the elementary or high school level. I'm not sure what the European equivalents of those are. It's also the most common way Warhammer 40,000 lore is typically discussed, particularly like in broad books like rule books or codexes. For example, the most important conflict in Imperial history is called the Horus Heresy. It's named after individuals. And even within like books like the Caiaphas Cain novels that use like in-universe footnotes from what are supposed to be in-universe historical works, these also tend to rely on sort of great man narratives or focusing on large-scale entities like nation states having all the agency. However, this is not like the only way historians like to tell history. It's very common for explaining it to the public, but it's in terms of historians, it's not necessarily a preferred method. Historians sometimes try to understand history on a smaller scale, like microhistory, or they tend to focus on history through certain lenses like class conflict, racial conflict, or gender. While the plight of average people in the Imperium of Man is referenced in the core rule books, it's actually referenced in the opening text for Warhammer 40,000, how it basically is completely miserable to be an average person in these times. And there are numerous novels somewhat set from the perspective of average people. But in terms of telling the history of the Imperium of Man, the agency of the people, of the masses, is significantly downplayed in contrast to the actions of a few men. In historiography, objectivity is an aspiration to be aimed for, but all historians are aware that objectivity is like not something that can ever be fully achieved. Every historian, including myself, works with certain biases that influence their work, and that's why we rely on other historians to come back to our work and critique it. It's what makes our own work better. Unlike real history, there are meta reasons for why lore in 40K changes over time. Games Workshop is ultimately creating lore for the sake of marketing plastic toy soldiers for customers to buy, build, paint, and then play with rules in a game that they publish and sell rules for. So my first example of this was the Rogel Dorn Battle Tank. It was introduced in 2022 for the 9th edition of the game. The Astra Militarum Codex for that year describes the Rogel Dorn tank as a defensive platform tank. While the Codex does not explicitly say the Dorn has been in service for thousands of years, one could assume that it has been in service for thousands of years, given the Imperium of Man's refusal to develop new technology. So presumably this tank has been in service for 10,000 years. And for whatever creative explanations we as the audience or an author can come up for why the Rogel Dorn tank has been in service for 10,000 years and never really mentioned by novels or previous rule books or whatever, the real reason is that Games Workshop wanted to to release a new tank for the Imperial Guard, which is obviously the point is to sell a new plastic kit. It's a good plastic kit, by the way. I really like it. But there was not a whole lot of, in terms of how fans received this sort of development to a beloved faction like the Imperial Guard, there wasn't a whole lot of backlash. That is not true of other developments in the lore. So at times, Games Workshop has added on to the lore in ways that do provoke a much more strong ideological response from fans. A few example from a few years ago was the inclusion of a Space Marine on the cover of the Avenging Sun novel, who was African American or was Black, and this provoked bit of a negative response from certain fans. But perhaps the most famous, more recent example of this was the inclusion of female custodes within the lore. Not only had women been added to the Adeptus Custodes in the lore, but it was also written in a way that seemingly implied that they had always been there among the ranks of the Emperor's personal bodyguards. The meta reasoning for this is almost certainly that Games Workshop wanted to broaden the appeal of the faction and of 40K in general. But there was many people within the fandom, particularly those who take the lore very seriously, who argued that including female custodes was a complete negation of the lore, that it upset how Games Workshop did lore or whatever. And I found this to be very interesting as a historian. It is worth pointing out how inconsistent gender roles are within the within the Imperium's armed forces. So looking over, going on the power scale from the Emperor's elite bodyguards all the way over to the Imperial Guard, the role of women within the Imperial Guard has actually shifted dramatically in terms of how gender is presented within that institution across the lore. So within the first Caiaphas Cain, Hero of the Imperium novel, it is implied that women participating in the Guard is relatively uncommon, that co-ed regiments are even more uncommon. And this is also a claim backed up in the book by an Inquisitor, Amberly Vale, who says as much in her footnotes, who presumably has access to a lot more information than your average Imperial historian or citizen does. It goes on later to say that the Imperium's first Lady General was Janet Sulla of Cain's regiment. And there are numerous other works that contradict the idea that Janet Sulla was the first female to hold the rank of general within the Imperial Guard. But many of those works were published after the Caiaphas Cain novels were published. So like the female Adeptus Custodes, portrayal of women in the Guard as fairly common is a product of relatively more recent publications. For comparison, the first Commissar Cain book was published in 2003, over 20 years ago, and books featuring Captain Minka Lusk were first published in 2016. Fan backlash to the inclusion of women in the Imperial Guard was much less intense than when women were included in the Custodes. And as a historian, the outrage over female custodes struck me as very perplexing because it is relatively common for historical narratives to write women out of the narrative due to biases of the author. And at least for me, understanding the biases of the author within every 40K lore is kind of the point of the setting. It's kind of what makes it interesting for me. But even setting aside ideological biases, the sheer material reality of the issues makes sense. Critics of inclusions of female custodes were largely silent when Games Workshop asked fans to believe that a battle tank that had been presumably seen by billions, if not trillions of people, was never really mentioned by any lore sources. However, the idea that the Emperor's very elite, very secretive bodyguards who for thousands of years never left one building, the idea that there were actually women among their ranks is a completely unbelievable idea that everyone should have reasonably been informed about. As previously discussed, there was a gap in understanding, at least within 40K lore, about how common women were within the Imperial Guard. which is the most ubiquitous common faction of the entire Imperium. So if the extent at which women serve in the Imperial Guard was something of an unknown question, then it certainly stands to reason that female participation within the Adeptus Custodes would also be somewhat hard to determine. However, Guardsmen are not as elite as the all-male Space Marines, and Custodes are considered more elite than Space Marines. So the ideological implication is that the Imperium of Man does produce women who are more martially superior to some men. And this obviously has a lot more of an ideological bent to it, or at least it's more threatening to the ideas of patriarchy and all that stuff. And actually, one of the official animated works for 40K is one of the Tides episode. A female custodian orders a captain of the White Templars to abandon a planet that they're honor bound to protect and to commit exterminatus on it, all for the sake of a strategic purpose. And he's clearly humiliated by this order, and it kind of gets at the ideological undertones of such an inclusion and why real world people might find that to be a bit upsetting. I think it's also somewhat humorous that, or at least ironic, that within the current lore of 40K, the Lord Regent Rabude Gilliman is trying to actually undertake an actual historical accounting of the Imperium and is met with strong opposition from elements of his own government in terms of trying to understand the history of the Imperium of Man. So both in real world and in the setting itself, trying to understand the history of the Imperium and how various people participate in it is met with backlash. But I'm afraid that the backlash that the 40K fandom experiences does have real world, or is downstream of real world debates. So in our real world, there's an ongoing public debate about how we should tell history, how history should be done for the public. So narratives that challenge or highlight unpleasantness of American history or European history, such as slavery and imperialism and colonialism. While these narratives have been relatively widespread within academia throughout the 20th century, they were beginning to make their way into more mainstream institutions and presentations by the 21st century. So histories that emphasize the role of women, LGBTQ people, people of color, and working class history all began to be made more mainstream by the 21st century. Probably the best work that's an example of this is A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which if you're not a historian is probably a point of reference book for most people if you've read a non-high school book about US history. So as we've all seen, these histories have provoked a backlash from conservatives in real life who've accused various nefarious elements of society of plotting to ruin history, to rewrite history, to make people hate their own nations and identities. And in the process of preparing this paper, sadly, the White House has been increasingly restricting the federal government's telling of history, like with the National Park Service, for example. So examples of this include the erasure of people of color within the armed forces, which certainly, given it's in the armed forces, has a lot of parallels to the institutions of 40K, the erasure of transgender people entirely from all historical narratives, and the White House's direct oversight on the exhibits within the Smithsonian Institution. So the aim of this paper was not to contend merely that there are parallels between the Imperium of Man and the US federal government when it comes to how they tell and discuss history. The parallels I wanted to draw were between how we as fans of Warhammer 40K and consumers of its lore can go about using more disciplined historiographical methods to understand that how we discuss the lore of 40K has real parallels to how we discuss our own history. And things that make us uncomfortable about the lore of a story, for example, have parallels to real world debates. And in fact, a lot of the debates that go on within the fandom of 40K lore are usually small scale skirmishes of larger arguments, right? The idea that women can't be can't be members of the Adeptus Custodes is ultimately a larger scale argument about how much do we want to discuss women within history, for example, or how visible do we want those people to be, for example. So the greater inclusion of minorities, people of color, and women within 40K lore is ultimately, you know, what makes 40K unique to me as a setting and as a historian. Why I've always found 40K to be very interesting since over a decade ago is because of its unreliable narrator and how, as a historian, my job is to handle primary sources and to treat them with scrutiny, to understand where the person who generated this source is coming from, what their life was like, and what sort of biases and limitations there might be on their information. And the really neat thing about 40K, for me at least, is that this is how I handle a lot of stuff within the lore. That it's not like Star Wars, for example, where there's like definitive answers. For example, everything should be handled as a primary source. When doing this paper, I treated a lot of these old rule books, and I actually have a small collection of them. I have like the 4th edition rule book as well as primary sources, right? And they do give conflicting information. And that's what makes it interesting, right? Because that's how real history is as well. There's all sorts of conflicting information within primary sources of history. The point, though, is that 40K lore and its discussions can be used as a way to then take those lessons and apply them to our own histories and understand the nuance and difficulties sometimes that are present within our own historical narratives.